Welcome to Municon 2021. I'm Jane Dool with the Port of Seattle and will be moderating for Optimal Mulching for GSI Management by David Jackson with Snohomish Conservation District. Please type your questions in the chat box. They will be answered following this presentation. David?
Thank you. I'm David. I'm in for Derek Hann today. We're going to talk about mulch and GSI. So a quick overview of bioretention. That is a garden or an installation which collects rainwater and stores it or allows it to infiltrate, collecting that rainwater from impermeable surfaces, and then supporting plants through special growing medium and topology. Mulch is a maintenance solution to a number of the issues around bioretention. One of the things that we get often is we love GSI, but we don't know how to maintain it, or we love GSI, but the maintenance and the weeding is too much. Mulch can be a solution to both of these issues as it significantly cuts down. It significantly cuts down on some of the maintenance inputs and also increases the function of the gardens. So this is bioretention soil. This area has been excavated and then backfilled with this specialized soil. If you're unfamiliar with bioretention soil, it's a mix of sand and compost, which holds enough water to support plants, which then take care of the water through evapotranspiration, and sand to allow it to infiltrate as fast as possible. What we found over doing dozens, even hundreds of these gardens is that this growth medium is an absolute very, very good growing medium for weeds. It's great for plants and it's great for every other weed that wants to come along. So the solution to that is to create a weed barrier throughout the garden of this mulch. It stops the weed from coming up from the bioretention layer, and it also stops weeds from falling from the being deposited from other plants and finding purchase. This mulch takes several forms. We'll be talking about those later, but it is very critical for the function of the garden. So the mulch does several things. It disperses weight because it is shredded. It forms a matrix and allows for people stepping or pushing on the garden in different places. Instead of compacting that soil, it spreads the weight more evenly. It prevents erosion. Some of these gardens are not always perfectly flat. So as water enters the garden, it prevents the water from shifting the garden too much or spilling out this very expensive soil. It also allows for infiltration. It will retain some water because it is biological, but it is shredded in such a way that it allows for water to flow into the gardens as rain falls directly on the gardens. It also holds the moisture in, which prevents the soil from becoming desiccated and not being able to support plant life. It prevents weed growth, as we said, by creating a barrier. It also provides texture and color, which is primarily an aesthetic landscaping a landscaping issue. So the ideal mulch mimics a forest duff layer. If you're unfamiliar with the term duff layer, that is essentially a layer of sticks and leaves and twigs and debris that falls on the forest floor. That is very important when trying to mimic some of these natural elements for rain infiltration, stormwater infiltration. We specifically want a low nutrient content because we don't want this to be attractive to plants. We don't want it to degrade too quickly, and we also don't want it to support any weeds. We want well-graded particle size, which means we want a series of different sizes, very irregular. We want it to be shredded as opposed to chips. Chips float. Throw a handful of playground chips into a pond, and you'll see what I mean. Shredded, they again tend to form that mat, which means that it does not float as easily. We want it to be fairly consistent throughout the installation. we want it to be inexpensive because we want to be able to do these at scale, and we want this to be in a thick layer. We'll talk about thickness a little bit later on, but we want it to be a minimum of 4 inches, ideally closer to 6. Problematic mulch is synthetic. We don't want any synthetics in this at all. We want to try to keep out any sort of metals or plastics that may come from other kinds of mulch. We don't want it to be high nutrient. As I mentioned before, we don't want it to be fine. Fine mulch tends to clog the garden and inhibit its function. We don't want it to be chipped. As I said, chipped floats. We don't want it to be inconsistent. You want to use one type of mulch throughout. We also don't want it to be expensive. You may run into issues with this where you have homeowners who, they really hate the look of it. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And we don't want it to be thin. We want it to be thick enough to actually provide that kind of barrier. So that brings us to animal-friendly hogs fuel. Animal-friendly hogs fuel is a very interesting type of mulch. It is primarily shredded sapwood. It's wood that does not necessarily make good lumber because it's usually very wet and it's usually very stringy, but it works perfectly for our purpose. It's often sugary, but even being sugary, it's still fairly low nutrient because it is that greener sapwood. It is shredded. Because it is animal friendly, that is very specific, the animal friendly part. It doesn't have nails or plastics in it. And it is often very inexpensive because it is a byproduct. Here's a closer look up of what that animal friendly hogs fuel looks like. You can see how shredded it looks. And you can see that there are different irregular sizes. There are some that are very long, some that are very wide, some that are short, some that are stringy, and some that are far more chippy. The composition of animal-friendly hogs fuel is 100% wood. As I said, there's no plastic, no nails. It's not cedar. We get a lot of questions about cedar. Cedar is not necessarily ideal for what we want to do, especially like sapwood or barkwood from cedar. There's no bark in it. It's not bark wood chips, it's specifically the sapwood. There's no leaves or needles. It is fine if leaves or needles drop on those, but we don't want to put it into the mulch. Again, those are highly nutritious things. And it is flame resistant. A lot of landscaping barks are not flame resistant. It is important that this be flame resistant, not necessarily for the fire aspect, but specifically because it's an indicator of it having the other qualities that we want. So you want to go to 3-inch minimum. I said 4 earlier. 3-inch really is the minimum. 4 is good. Up to 6 inches. If you go up to 6 inches, you may end up having issues with planting. You want to make sure that your plant roots are in the soil, and up to 6 inches means you can really bury some of those plants. So you want to kind of find the right depth for yourself. Like I said, 4 is probably ideal, but 3 is minimum. Up to 6 is sort of the maximum, depending. You really want to be refreshing this every 1 to 2 years. At the start, maybe for the first year or 2, you want to be refreshing it pretty consistently. But after the vegetation is established, it becomes less necessary from a maintenance standpoint because the plants will do a good job shading out and preventing the weeds. Animal-friendly hogs fuel is not always available. We in Snohomish Conservation District are very fortunate. Smith Island Pacific Topsoils has this product, and we use it consistently. We've actually drug it to other jurisdictions when we need to. If you call around, you can usually find it. This stuff is fairly commonly used in agriculture because it is it's called animal friendly because it is animal friendly, and it's often used as bedding. It is it's not an uncommon thing, but it may be difficult to find. Do call around. This really is the best stuff that you can get, and it's worth the extra effort. If you are absolutely unable to find it, arborist chips can work, but again, there are some issues with arborist chips, in particular floating. So you may need to find some workarounds with those. If you have people who absolutely hate the animal-friendly hogs fuel, they hate the look of it. We've had those people before. You can do a top dressing of bark nuggets. Bark nuggets are in many ways the opposite of animal-friendly hogs fuel. They are chips, specifically made out of bark, often Doug fir bark because it's so thick. And it's far more attractive. It looks a little bit closer to beauty bark. And putting a top dressing down over those doesn't impact the function of the garden or the animal-friendly hogs fuel, but people find that it looks much more attractive. Bear in mind, if you really want to do this, that means that either you are going to be needing to pull this back to add more mulch consistently, or you are going to need to do a second top dressing of bark nuggets every time you do animal-friendly hogs fuel, which will become far more expensive. So if that's you or your cooperator doing that, you just need to make sure that you have that conversation with them about cost. Lastly, I want to talk about mulching under riprap. A lot of people, I installed gardens for a long time, and sort of modus operandi for a lot of people is you put down the bioretention, then you put down the rock, and then you mulch over the top of that. At Snohomish Conservation District, we put down the mulch first and then add the rock separately. And I can say now, with having experienced both ways, if you have the rock on top of the mulch, your maintenance between the rocks is significantly reduced. I think we've all been there where we try to weed in between rocks and get weeds out from rocks, and it's one of the most frustrating things. Having that barrier underneath the rock of the mulch, it doesn't inhibit what the rocks are doing because the rocks are so gathered around that inlet and outlet. But it does mean that there are fewer weeds that can infiltrate between those rocks. That is all that I have for you today. I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, David. There is a question from Cass. Great material hog fuel. As you stated, the hog fuel retards growth. How do you address the lag in establishment of the plants that are intentionally planted in the bottom of the cells and side slopes? Plant growth rate will be limited. What have you found to balance growth rates to achieve satisfactory plant establishment while you use the hog fuel for mulch? I've heard it locks up all the nutrients and makes nutrients less available to the intending plants.
So I think I understand what you're saying. It doesn't necessarily lock up nutrients because the nutrients the plants are getting is primarily coming from the bioretention. It is locking up nutrients that are essentially coming in from things like debris and deposition. That is important because you want to lock those up because that is one of your vectors for weeds coming in. The plants that we are planting are planted directly with their roots directly into the bioretention soil. And that's where they are drawing their primary growth medium. Everything that they need per the garden's design is coming from that bioretention layer, including their food, water, and then growing up through the mulch and photosynthesizing above it. I hope that answers your question. Or I guess a direct answer would be, we're planting the plants directly into we're pulling the mulch aside to plant the plants directly into the bioretention and then moving the mulch back to cover up as much of that bioretention as possible without harming the plants. I hope that answers your question. If I'm misunderstanding something, please feel free to get back at me.
David, this is Cass. Just follow up on that. Thank you for the answer. Do you have any studies where you guys have looked at cells that have the hog fuel as mulch and cells that don't for plant establishment rates?
No, we don't. I believe that there is a current mulch study going on at the WSU Stormwater Center that both Derek and I consulted on. Mm-hmm. But we do not have any studies. This is mainly, Derek and I combined have probably, Derek Hann, if you're not familiar, is the engineer. He was the one who was originally supposed to do this presentation, but had something come up at the last moment, so I am standing in for him. He and I combined have probably built 300, 400 gardens, both in a variety of different ways. This is sort of our collected wisdom with that sample size of gardens, saying this is what we've seen most often work. I believe as far as a peer-reviewed study though, either this year or next year, WSU Stormwater Center should have something coming out.
Just from an experience level, what I have seen with those arborist chip cells, the plant rate growth is pretty slow. So I wonder about, and then that's only observational. So I'm concerned about it a little bit.
Yeah, the arborist, are you saying arborist chips or animal-friendly Hogs fuel? Because they are a very different material. Can
you describe what the difference is?
Yes.
We have a few more questions, so I just want to make sure you're aware of that.
Yes, I will make sure that we get to those. The animal-friendly Hogs fuel is a very different material. It is a shredded. So back in the day when when you were first logging, they had these furnaces called Hogs. And when you would fell a tree, you would strip out all of the sapwood that couldn't be used for lumber, and that would be fed into the hog because it was basically cheap fuel. That's where the term Hogs fuel comes from. So it is this highly sugary, still very wet, oftentimes somewhat green, shredded woody material that is very different from arborist chips, which is the entirety of a tree that has been mulched out. They're also very different in terms of structure. Hogs fuel specifically forms a matrix, but it's a very permeable matrix that allows water to infiltrate and allows water to get down while still creating a matrix that stops larger particles from getting down, such as seeds or dust or pollen or spore. I can say that we've had the exact opposite issue. We have had to go back and pull out plants that we have planted previously because they have gotten too large. And we now have actually restricted our plant list because we don't want people planting plants that will end up getting too large and dominating our gardens. So please email me and we can keep this conversation going. I'm going to move on to some of the other questions though, but I would be more than happy to talk about this with you later.
Okay. Thanks, David. The next question from Julie Christian. Is there a specification written for the mulch David describes that local governments can add to their contract special provisions?
I do not believe that we have a written specification. We have, in all of our technical reports to the Department of Ecology, we have mentioned this specifically, and we have established this in our documentation as best practice. I do not know if I do not believe DOE has adopted that or if there's any official stance on that.
Great. Next is a comment from Christy Cox. If you can't find hog fuel and want to use arborist chips, this is a free resource. She gives a getchipdrop.com website.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Christy from the city of Bothell. That is a wonderful resource. I have a whole separate talk that I give to homeowners about how to use chip drop most effectively. If you would like to get any of that, please go ahead and contact me. Similarly, since we have a lot of people from municipalities, if you have a tree service or a chipper truck, that is another way to do that. Also, I'd be more than happy to talk to people about that offline as well.
Next is J. Scott Kindred. How often are you replacing the mulch?
Every 2 years, possibly. You want to replace it after the first year. It depends on kind of how thickly you put it down, how quickly your plants are coming up, and how if you have sort of other things going on, such as if it's a roadside and it's accumulating a lot of sediment, you may want to replace it in the first year, but usually the first 2 years.
Great. I had that question too, so thank you. WSU's literature, this is from Peggy Campbell. WSU's literature review on wood chips, not totally the same, yet principles are strongly similar. So another website from Puyallup, WSU. Yep. John Hudson, is there a difference between conifer-based and deciduous-based hog fuel?
Not strongly. There probably would be a somewhat difference in terms of the sugar level, with deciduous trees having higher sugar in their sapwood. But the sugar really isn't what we're after. So for our purposes, no, not really.
Okay. And Cass again, WSDOT standard spec has standard spec for animal-friendly hog fuel, but doesn't have the specifics discussed here. Thank you, Cass. Anything to add on that one?
No, and I'll go back to what Peggy said. Peggy from Snohomish County. Thanks, Peggy. Yes, there definitely is literature out there about kind of what kind of mulch wants to go down, and putting mulch down on these gardens is definitely best practice. Specifically, what we're talking about here is a far more narrow application of this and a far more narrow specification of this that we have found effective. And again, this is primarily just experience-based from Derek and I.
From Allison Schweitzer, I love chip drop. I might have missed this, but does the AFHF have a sweet odor to it, given all of the sugary references you've made?
No, that's man, maybe I'm just hungry. But no, it doesn't really. It's actually, it doesn't smell like a ton. It smells like wood chips. Anybody who's worked in landscaping a lot, you kind of know that fresh wood chip smell. It's that, but a little bit toned down because there's not nearly as much dust that comes up from them because of the nature of the wood. Yeah, there's not really a scent to it. Some people, homeowners we've had, will claim they don't like the scent, they don't like the smell, they don't like the look, and that's where the bark nuggets come in. And I see that we only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get to KL Miller's question as well.
Yeah. So how are you disposing of spent mulch?
Spent mulch is biodegradable. It's something that can be composted. So if you have a material yard that will take, it often won't come in as clean green because it usually does have soil attached to it, either sediment coming in from the top or bioretention that's sticking to it from the bottom. But it can be disposed of. In any sort of biomass yard. You can take it right back to Cedar Grove and they'll take care of it for you.
And another from Skylar, I'm sorry if I mispronounced. Are any of these gardens privately maintained? Any difficulties in getting private facilities to replace the mulch?
No, not really. So at the Conservation District, we have a mix of private and public gardens. When we have homeowners, the gardens are usually small enough that we ask them to take care of them, and they do a very good job. For larger gardens, sometimes we will offer to take care of it for the first few years in order to make sure that they are properly maintained and they're significantly larger gardens. In that case, we usually are responsible for the first mulch replacement, and then by that time the plants are grown up and we don't have to worry nearly as much about the second. But homeowners in particular seem, the mulch is not particularly expensive. We build them in clusters. So usually the people that are also maintaining them are their neighbors. They were built at the same time. So they kind of go in together to get, like, you know, a shipment of mulch dropped. And then they'll all kind of split that up and split the cost. So it's kind of a matter of outreach. And of course, you know, as a conservation district, we're always on hand to advise that. And we'll do follow-up a couple years on to go around to the gardens and make sure that everyone's comfortable with the maintenance.
I'm not seeing any other new questions. Are there any? We have a couple more minutes.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Yeah, I'm so happy that I got a chance to jump in here a little bit last minute. If anybody does have any follow-up questions or would like to continue any of the conversations that we started today, my contact information is down there on the slide as well as online. Please drop me a line. I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, hope to hear from some of you.
Thanks so much, David.
I hope to hear from all of you, but I specifically hope at least some of you drop me a line.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.